The morning sun rose over New Haven Colony like it had for 40 years, painting the purple forests in shades of gold and orange that reminded the settlers of Earth sunrises they had only seen in pictures. And the 2 million people who called this world home went about their daily lives without any idea that death was falling from the sky grace. Mitchell stood on the observation deck of the orbital station called Horizon's Edge, her coffee growing cold in her hands as she watched cargo ships move between the station and the planet below, thinking about how peaceful everything looked from up here, how the city sparkled like jewels scattered across the alien landscape she had grown to love. She had served in the United Earth Defense Force for 12 years and had seen her share of border skirmishes with minor species. But nothing in her training or experience prepared her for what happened next. The stars began to disappear. At first, she thought it was a glitch in the observation window, some kind of technical malfunction that maintenance would need to fix. But then she realized the truth, and her blood turned to ice in her veins. Those were not stars vanishing from view. Those were ships blocking out the light, hundreds of them, emerging from slip space in perfect formation, like a wall of death spreading across the heavens. "Get me Admiral Howard," she said to the officer beside her, surprised at how calm her voice sounded when every instinct in her body screamed at her to run. "Get me Admiral Howard right now." The Valorian warships numbered over 300, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built, their hulls gleaming with a metallic sheen that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And they moved with a terrible grace that spoke of technology far beyond human understanding on the surface below. A farmer named Danny Cole was teaching his 8-year-old daughter Lily how to ride the horse he had bought her for her birthday, laughing as she bounced awkwardly in the saddle and told him she was going to be the best rider on the whole planet. "Daddy, look at the sky," Lily said suddenly, pointing upward with one small hand. Danny looked up and saw streaks of light cutting through the atmosphere, beautiful and terrifying, like shooting stars falling in the wrong direction. And in that moment, he understood what was happening, even though his mind refused to accept it. Grabbed Lily off the horse and ran. The first plasma strike hit the capital city of Haven's Landing and vaporized 300,000 people in less than a second. The heat so intense that buildings did not burn, but simply ceased to exist, leaving behind nothing but glass craters where homes and schools and hospitals had stood moments before Danny ran for the underground shelter his grandfather had insisted on building when the colony was first established. The old man's paranoia finally proving to be wisdom rather than madness. And he could hear Lily screaming as explosions tore the world apart behind them. "Don't look back, sweetheart," he gasped as he ran. "Just hold on to Daddy and don't look back." The farmhouse where Lily had taken her first steps, where Danny had built a life with his wife before cancer took her 2 years ago, where every happy memory of the past decade lived, vanished in a column of white fire that he felt on his back like the breath of an angry god. They reached the shelter, and Danny sealed the heavy door behind them just as the shockwave hit, throwing them both to the ground as the earth itself seemed to scream in agony above them in orbit. Grace Mitchell watched her world die. "They're not responding to any communication attempts," the communications officer reported, his voice cracking with fear. "They're not demanding surrender or issuing warnings or anything at all. They're just firing." "Evacuation status," Grace demanded. "We've launched every shuttle and escape pod we have, but there's nowhere safe to go. The Valorians are shooting down anything that tries to leave the atmosphere." Grace grabbed the emergency transmitter and began recording, knowing this message might be the last thing anyone ever heard from New Haven. "This is Lieutenant Commander Grace Mitchell aboard Horizon's Edge Orbital Station, transmitting to all United Earth Forces. New Haven Colony is under attack by Valorian warships. They struck without warning and without provocation. Estimate 90% casualties in the first hour. They're not stopping. They're burning everything. God help us, they're burning everything. The station shuddered as Valorian weapons found their range. And Grace knew she had only moments left. She ran for the escape pod bay, her lungs burning and her heart pounding. Passing crew members who were praying and crying and holding each other as death came for them all. She reached the last remaining pod just as the station began to break apart, throwing herself inside and slamming the launch button. As the hull behind her peeled away like paper in a hurricane, the pod shot away from the dying station and Grace watched through the tiny window as Horizon's Edge fell from orbit. A burning meteor that had once been home to 5,000 people who had trusted her to keep them safe. Below her, New Haven continued to burn. The Valorians were thorough, she realized with horror. They were not simply attacking military targets or population centers. They were systematically destroying everything. Every city and town and village, every farm and factory and forest. As if they intended to erase not just the people, but any evidence that humanity had ever set foot on this world. They intended to erase not just the people, but any evidence that humanity had ever set foot on this world. The bombardment lasted for 6 hours when it finally ended. New Haven was dead. The purple forests that had taken 40 years to cultivate were ash. The cities were glass craters. The oceans were boiling. And 2 million human beings had been reduced to shadows and memories. But the Valorians made a mistake that would cost them their empire. They left survivors in the underground shelter. Danny Cole held his daughter as she cried herself to sleep, promising her that everything would be okay, even though he knew nothing would ever be okay again. Feeling something cold and hard forming in his chest, where grief and rage combined into something new and terrible in the escape pod drifting through the debris field that had once been a thriving orbital community. Grace Mitchell recorded everything she had witnessed, every detail of the attack, every ship configuration and weapon signature, building a case file for a war that had not yet been declared. And across the vast distances of space, the message reached Earth Admiral Patricia Howard listened to Grace's transmission aboard the carrier Vigilant, her face pale and her hands steady as she absorbed the full scope of the atrocity. "How many survivors?" she asked quietly. "No, ma'am. But estimates suggest less than 10,000 out of a population of 2 million. Patricia closed her eyes for a long moment. And when she opened them again, something had changed in their depths. Something that would have frightened anyone who knew her well enough to recognize it. "Set course for Earth," she ordered. "Maximum speed." "What are we going to do, ma'am?" Patricia Howard looked at the image of the burning colony one last time, memorizing every detail, making a promise to the dead that she intended to keep no matter what it cost. "We're going to make them pay," she said simply. "We're going to make them pay for every single life they took today. And when we're done, the galaxy will remember what happens when you try to burn humanity from existence." The war had begun. The chamber in Geneva had never been so quiet. Not in the 200 years since the United Earth government had been established. Not during the resource wars or the plague years, or any of the countless crises that had threatened to tear humanity apart. Secretary General Victor Reyes stood at the podium and looked out at the assembled representatives of every nation and colony in human space, seeing the same expression on every face, a mixture of grief and shock and something else that he recognized because he felt it, burning in his own chest. Rage. 3 weeks ago, the Valorian Dominion attacked our colony on New Haven. "Without warning or provocation," he said, his voice carrying through the silent chamber. "They killed nearly 2 million of our people, including women and children and elderly citizens who pose no threat to anyone. They burned our cities and poisoned our oceans and left behind nothing but ash and glass." He paused to let the words sink in, watching as delegates wiped tears from their eyes or clenched their fists in helpless anger. We have attempted to establish diplomatic contact with the Valorians through every channel available to us. We have asked for explanations and offered negotiations and requested simply that they tell us why they murdered our people. He pressed a button on the podium and an alien voice filled the chamber, translated by computer into cold mechanical tones that somehow made the message even more terrible. Your species occupies worlds that belong to the Dominion. You have been warned. Your other colonies will follow. Resistance is biological error. The chamber erupted in shouts of outrage and cries of disbelief. And Victor let them vent their emotions for a full minute before raising his hand for silence. They have told us plainly what they intend. He continued. They mean to exterminate us. Not because we threatened them or attacked them or did anything at all except exist in a universe they believe belongs to them alone. Senator Catherine Webb of the North American Union rose from her seat. Her eyes red from crying, but her voice steady and strong. My sister was a teacher on New Haven, she said. She taught third-grade science and spent her weekends volunteering at the Colony Hospital. My niece Megan was 7 years old and wanted to be an astronaut when she grew up. She looked around the chamber at her fellow representatives. The Valorians killed them not because they were soldiers or threats, but simply because they were human. I move that we invoke Article 7 of the United Earth Charter. Total war against the Valorian Dominion. No negotiation, no retreat. No surrender until this threat to our existence is eliminated. The vote was unanimous in the depths of the Pacific Fleet headquarters, buried beneath the ocean floor. Admiral Patricia Howard convened a meeting of the most brilliant minds humanity had to offer. Scientists and engineers and tacticians who had spent their careers preparing for a war they hoped would never come. I won't lie to you about our situation, she told them, her voice calm despite the fear she felt. The Valorians have been a spacefaring civilization for 3,000 years longer than us. They have faster ships and more powerful weapons, and they outnumber us by a factor of at least 10 to 1. She pulled up tactical projections showing the disparity in forces. Watching as the reality of their situation sank in, every conventional model we've run says we lose this war. If we fight the way we've always fought, we will be destroyed just like they promised. A man in civilian clothes raised his hand, his hair disheveled and his eyes showing the telltale signs of too many sleepless nights. Then we don't fight conventionally, said Dr. Samuel Price, the theoretical physicist whose work had revolutionized human space travel a decade earlier. He stood and walked to the main display, pulling up schematics that made several people in the room gasp in horror. For the past 5 years, a small team has been working on something we called Project Prometheus. We never thought we would actually use it because, frankly, we were terrified of what we had created. But the situation has changed. The display showed a device that looked almost simple. A sphere no larger than a basketball, surrounded by complex machinery. This weapon can collapse the quantum structure of matter at a stellar level, Samuel explained, his voice barely above a whisper. When deployed near a star, it destabilizes the nuclear fusion process and causes the star to go dark. Not supernova, the star simply dies. It stops producing light and heat within a matter of weeks. Admiral Howard stared at the schematics with an expression that might have been awe or might have been horror. What happens to the planets in that system when the star dies? She asked. Already knowing the answer, they freeze, Samuel said flatly. Every world in the system becomes uninhabitable within months. Any civilization dependent on that star dies with it. How many people are we talking about? The Valorian home system contains 12 inhabited worlds with a combined population of approximately 40 billion. The room went completely silent. Patricia walked to the window and looked out at the artificial lights that illuminated the underwater facility. Thinking about the weight of the decision she was being asked to make, They killed 2 million of our people," she said quietly. "You're asking me to authorize a weapon that could kill 40 billion of theirs. I'm asking you to authorize a weapon that could end this war before they kill 200 million of ours," Samuel replied. "Or 2 billion or 20 billion. However many it takes before they've wiped us all out." Patricia turned back to face him. "Can you live with that, Doctor? Can you live with being the man who killed 40 billion people?" Samuel's face was pale, but his voice was steady. "I can live with saving humanity. I can live with making sure my daughter grows up in a universe where she doesn't have to be afraid of being burned alive simply for being human." Patricia nodded slowly. Feeling the weight of history settling on her shoulders, "Begin construction," she ordered. "And God help us all for what we're about to do." The scientists filed out to begin their terrible work, and Patricia remained alone in the conference room, staring at the schematics of the weapon that would either save her species or damn it. Forever she thought about New Haven and the 2 million dead. She thought about the other colonies still out there, waiting for the Valorians to come for them. She thought about Earth itself and the 10 billion people who had never asked for this war, but would die in it. If she failed, "Forgive me," she whispered to no one in particular. "Forgive me for what I'm about to become." Outside in the dark waters of the Pacific, fish swam past the facility without any awareness of the decisions being made within its walls. Decisions that would reshape the galaxy and determine the fate of species that had never even heard of humanity. The Valorians had wanted to burn humanity from existence. They had no idea what they had awakened. The war that followed was brutal beyond anything humanity had experienced in its long and violent history. A conflict that stretched across dozens of star systems and claimed millions of lives on both sides. Though the scales remained tilted heavily against the humans, who fought with desperate courage against an enemy that seemed endless. The Valorians struck at colony after colony with the same methodical cruelty they had shown at New Haven, burning Proxima Centauri and the mining stations of Epsilon Eridani and the beautiful ocean world of Pacifica, where 300,000 people had built floating cities on crystal blue seas. Each time the news reached Earth, there were vigils and memorials, and speeches about never forgetting. And each time the recruitment offices overflowed with volunteers who wanted nothing more than to make the enemy pay for what they had. Grace Mitchell had survived the fall of Horizon's Edge by sheer luck and refused to call it anything else. Her escape pod had drifted for 3 days before a patrol ship found her half dead from dehydration and oxygen deprivation. Now, she commanded a fleet of survivors who called themselves the Burned Ones. Men and women who had lost everything to Valorian plasma and had nothing left except the burning need for vengeance. Contact bearing 270. Her sensor officer reported. Valorian supply convoy, 6 transports with light escort. Grace studied the tactical display with cold, calculating eyes, her mind running through the possibilities with the precision of a machine. "They're heading for the Valorian forward base at Sigma Draconis," she said. "Those supplies are meant to fuel their next offensive. Orders, ma'am." Grace smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "We take them, all of them. I want those transports captured intact and their escorts turned into debris." The Burned Ones attacked with a ferocity that terrified even their allies. Their ships moving through the Valorian formation like wolves among sheep, tearing apart the escort vessels with weapons fire so accurate it seemed almost supernatural. The truth was simpler and sadder. Grace had spent 2 years studying every piece of intelligence about Valorian tactics and ship configurations, memorizing their patterns and predicting their responses, turning her grief into expertise that made her the most effective guerrilla commander in the fleet. Danny Cole watched the battle from the weapons station aboard the destroyer Reckoning, his fingers steady on the controls as he poured fire into a Valorian cruiser that was trying to protect the convoy. He had enlisted the day after reaching Earth as a refugee, leaving his daughter Lily with relatives on the lunar colony where she would be safe, or at least safer than anywhere else in human space. I'm going to make sure no other little girl loses her home the way you did, he had told her before boarding the transport that would take him to basic training. And then I'm coming back, I promise. Captain Benjamin Shaw commanded the reckoning from the bridge. A quiet man with sad eyes who had lost his husband on New Haven and never spoke about it except in the way he fought. With a cold precision that left no room for mercy or hesitation. Target the command ship, Shaw ordered. His voice flat and emotionless. All weapons. Maximum rate of fire. The Reckoning's guns roared and the Valorian command vessel came apart in a spectacular explosion that scattered debris across thousands of kilometers. The convoy surrendered back on Earth. Dr. Samuel Price worked on the Prometheus device with a dedication that bordered on obsession, sleeping only when his body absolutely refused to continue, eating only when his assistants forced food into his hands. The weapon was nearly complete, but there was a problem that kept him awake. During the few hours he allowed himself to rest, we need to deliver the device to the heart of the Valorian home system, he explained to Admiral Howard during one of their encrypted conferences. Their homeworld orbits a binary star. If we collapse the primary, the gravitational disruption will affect every planet in the system. And the problem? Their defenses are impenetrable. We've run thousands of simulations and there's no way to get a ship through without being detected and destroyed long before it reaches the deployment zone. Patricia nodded slowly, her mind already working on the solution. Then we need to make sure they're looking somewhere else, she said. We need to give them something so big and so threatening that they pull their defenses away from the home system to deal with it. What could possibly be big enough to accomplish that? Patricia smiled grimly. Everything we have. Doctor, we throw everything we have at their border systems in the largest offensive in human history. We make them believe we're trying to invade their territory. And while they're busy dealing with that, a single ship slips through and ends the war. Samuel finished, understanding dawning in his exhausted eyes. Can you have the device ready in 6 months? I can have it ready in 4. Patricia began planning Operation Burning Dawn, coordinating with every fleet commander and colony governor and military leader in human space, assembling an armada that would either save humanity or die trying 340 ships. Nearly every combat vessel humanity possessed would jump into Valorian border space and engage the enemy in a battle that everyone knew they could not win. But winning was not the point. The point was distraction. Sacrifice, a feint on a scale that would be remembered for as long as humans existed to remember anything. Grace Mitchell volunteered to lead the assault force, knowing full well what it meant. Someone has to keep them busy long enough for the real mission to succeed. She told Admiral Howard, my people are the best at impossible odds. We've been fighting them for 2 years with nothing but scraps and determination. You understand you probably won't survive. Grace thought about Horizon's Edge falling from orbit, about the screams on the communication channels as 2 million people died, about everything she had lost and everything that was still worth fighting for. I understand, she said simply, and I volunteer anyway. Danny Cole learned about the operation during a briefing aboard the Reckoning and felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. This was what he had been waiting for. This was the moment when all the pain and rage would finally mean something. He sat down that night and wrote a letter to his daughter, telling her how much he loved her and how proud he was of the young woman she was becoming. Telling her that no matter what happened, she should never forget that her father had died trying to make the universe safe for her. I promised I would come back, he wrote at the end. And I meant it. But sometimes the most important promises are the ones we keep for everyone, not just the people we love. I'm doing this for you, sweetheart. For you and for every child who deserves to grow up without being afraid." He sealed the letter and gave it to the chaplain with instructions to deliver it if he did not return. The G fleet assembled at the edge of human space. 340 ships carrying the hopes and fears of an entire species, waiting for the order that would send them into the fire. Admiral Howard watched them from the bridge of the carrier Unconquerable, feeling the weight of command pressing down on her shoulders. "All ships report." "Ready, ma'am," her aide announced. Patricia took a deep breath and opened a channel. "To the entire fleet, today we strike back," she said, her voice carrying to every ship and every crew member in the armada. "Today we show the Valorians what humans are made of. Not everyone will survive this battle, but those who fall will be remembered as heroes who gave their lives to save their species." She paused, letting the words sink in. "They burned our colonies. They murdered our people. They told us we were nothing but a biological error to be corrected. Today, we prove them wrong. Today, we show them that humanity does not surrender, does not submit, does not die quietly in the dark." The fleet jumped to war. The Valorian border system of Cathra Prime had never seen anything like the wave of human ships that erupted from slipspace with weapons already firing. 340 vessels screaming out of the darkness like avenging angels come to collect the debt paid in blood, and Fire Admiral Howard stood on the bridge of the Unconquerable and watched the tactical display light up with enemy contacts. Over 1,000 Valorian warships scrambling to meet the unexpected assault. "All ships engage at will," she commanded, her voice calm despite the chaos erupting around her. "Remember why we're here. Remember New Haven. Remember Proxima. Remember Pacifica. Make them pay for every single life they took." The battle was chaos incarnate, a swirling maelstrom of energy, weapons and missile fire and dying ships that turned the darkness of space into something that looked almost beautiful from a distance. Commander Grace Mitchell led the burned ones directly into the heart of the Valorian formation, her ships weaving through enemy fire with maneuvers that should have been impossible, drawing the attention of the largest enemy vessels away from the main fleet. Pattern 7, she ordered through gritted teeth as her ship shuddered from a near miss. "Keep them focused on us, keep them angry, keep them chasing." Her pilots obeyed without hesitation, diving into the enemy formation with a reckless courage that made the Valorians uncertain. For the first time in the battle, these humans were not fighting like a species trying to survive. They were fighting like a species that had nothing left to lose. Danny Cole manned his weapons station aboard the Reckoning as Captain Shaw drove the destroyer deep into enemy territory, targeting Valorian command ships with the cold efficiency of a surgeon removing tumors. "Contact bearing 180, Danny reported. "Heavy cruiser coming around to intercept." "I see it," Shaw replied. "All weapons target that ship. Full power to forward shields." The Reckoning traded fire with the cruiser at point-blank range, both ships tearing chunks out of each other with every volley. And Danny found himself thinking about his daughter as he poured death into the enemy vessel. He wondered if she was watching the news feeds back on Luna, if she knew her father was fighting in the biggest battle in human history, if she understood what he was fighting for. Cruiser exploded, and Shaw immediately swung the Reckoning toward the next target, not pausing to celebrate or even acknowledge the victory. There was no time for celebration. There was only the fight, while the border battle raged with all the fury of a species facing extinction. A single ship slipped away from the chaos and set course for the Valorian home system. The Silent Blade was the most advanced stealth vessel ever built by human hands, designed specifically for this mission. Equipped with technology that should have been impossible, and crewed by volunteers who had accepted that they would never see their homes. Again, Lieutenant Amy Grant piloted the ship with steady hands, her eyes fixed on the navigation display as they approached the greatest concentration of enemy defenses in the known galaxy. Approaching the outer sensor perimeter, she reported quietly. No sign of detection. Behind her, Dr. Samuel Price sat with the Prometheus device in his lap. The weapon that would either save humanity or make him the greatest mass murderer in history. He was not sure which description frightened him more. "The device is ready," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All systems are functioning within parameters." Amy nodded without taking her eyes off her controls. Then we continue. They slipped past defense stations and patrol ships and automated weapons platforms, moving so slowly and carefully that the journey took 3 times longer than a normal ship would have needed. But speed was not important. Only success mattered. The battle at Kalara Prime entered its 8th hour, and the human fleet was dying. Ship after ship falling to Valorian weapons. But they refused to retreat, refused to surrender, refused to give the enemy any reason to stop fighting and look elsewhere. Grace Mitchell's flagship took a direct hit that killed half her bridge crew and left her bleeding from a wound on her forehead. But she stayed at her station and kept fighting, kept commanding, kept drawing enemy attention away from the real mission. "All ships maintain formation," she ordered through the pain. "We hold this line no matter what." Danny Cole felt the reckoning shudder as another volley struck their shields. The lights flickering as power systems struggled to compensate, shields at 30%. Someone reported. "We can't take much more of this." Captain Shaw's expression never changed. "Then we'll take what we can," he said simply. "Helm, bring us around for another pass." The silent blade reached the inner system where the twin stars of the Valorian homeworld blazed with ancient light. And Amy Grant allowed herself a moment to appreciate the terrible beauty of what she was about to destroy. "We're in position," she announced. "Doctor, it's time." Samuel looked down at the device in his hands. The simple sphere that contained enough destructive potential to end an entire civilization. And he thought about all the people who would die because of what he was about to do. 40 billion lives, maybe more. Scientists and artists and children and families who had never heard of New Haven and had no part in the decision to burn it from existence. But he also thought about his own daughter back on Earth, about Danny Cole's daughter on Luna, about all the human children who would grow up free and safe because of this moment. "Amy," he said quietly, "are you sure about this? There might be another way." "There might be. There isn't," she replied gently, reaching back to squeeze his hand. "They burned our homes, they killed our families. They told us they would keep doing it until we were all gone. This is the only way to make sure humanity survives." She looked at him with eyes that held no hatred, no rage, only a sad acceptance of what had to be done. "It's okay to save your people, Doctor. That's not evil. That's love." Samuel activated the device. A pulse of energy that registered on no known sensors shot out from the silent blade and struck the primary star of the Valorian home system, beginning a process that could not be stopped or reversed. The star flickered back at Kalara Prime. Admiral Howard received a coded message that contained only 2 words: "Phoenix Rising." She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of what had just been set in motion, then opened them and gave an order that surprised everyone on the bridge. "All ships, begin withdrawal." The human fleet disengaged and jumped away, leaving the Valorians confused and uncertain about why their enemy had suddenly retreated after fighting so ferociously for so long. They would understand soon enough. Amy Grant watched through the silent blade sensors as the Valorian primary star began to dim, the first visible sign of the catastrophe that would unfold over the coming weeks. "It's done," she said quietly. Samuel nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down his face as he contemplated the magnitude of what he had unleashed. "Set course for the rendezvous point," Amy ordered. "We need to report mission success." But they both knew the truth. there was no success in what they had done. Only survival, only the desperate act of a species that had been pushed to the edge of extinction and had pushed back with everything it had. The silent blade turned away from the dying star and began the long journey home, leaving behind a civilization that did not yet know it was already dead. The Valorian primary star took 12 days to show the first visible signs of death, a slight dimming that their astronomers initially dismissed as instrument error. But the dimming continued and accelerated until there could be no doubt about what was happening. The star that had warmed their civilization for millions of years was dying. Within a week, the temperature on the Valorian homeworld dropped by 20 degrees, and the crops that fed billions began to wither in fields that had never known true cold. Within a month, the oceans began to cool, and the weather patterns that had sustained their civilization for thousands of years spiraled into chaos. The Valorian government understood what had happened, even if they refused to accept it. The humans had done something to their sun, something that could not be undone, something that would kill their entire species if they did not find a solution. They sent ships to investigate and found nothing. The star was simply dying, as if it had reached the natural end of its life cycle billions of years ahead of schedule. There was no enemy to fight, no weapon to destroy, no way to reverse what had been done. The dominion that had ruled over 200 star systems for 5,000 years found itself facing extinction at the hands of a species it had dismissed as biological errors. Their colonies could not support the population of their homeworlds. Their fleet was scattered and damaged from the border battle. Their allies refused to help a dying empire. And every day the star grew darker and the cold grew deeper. 3 months after the deployment of the Prometheus device, the Valorian government sent a message to Earth, one word, repeated on every frequency they could transmit. Peace Secretary General Victor Reyes received the message in the same chamber where he had declared war 3 years earlier, surrounded by the survivors of humanity's leadership, men and women who had guided their species through the darkest chapter of its history. "They're asking for terms," he announced, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that showed in every line of his face. Admiral Patricia Howard stood slowly, her uniform decorated with medals she had never asked for and honors she did not feel she deserved. "They killed 2 million of our people at New Haven," she said. "They burned 5 more colonies before we could stop them. They told us they would not rest until every human was dead." She looked around the chamber at faces that reflected her own complicated mixture of triumph and grief. "We give them the same terms they gave us: unconditional surrender, complete disarmament, reparations that will take them 1,000 years to pay, and they evacuate their home system entirely because that star is not going to recover. And if they refuse," Victor asked. Patricia's eyes were hard as steel, "then we use Prometheus on every star they have left." The Valorians did not refuse. The war ended not with a final battle, but with a treaty signed in Geneva, the representatives of a dying empire agreeing to every demand. Because the alternative was complete annihilation. Danny Cole survived the battle at Kethra Prime and returned to Luna to find his daughter waiting for him at the spaceport, taller than he remembered, and older in ways that had nothing to do with the years that had passed. She ran to him the way she had when she was small, and he held her and wept for the first time since New Haven, crying for everything they had lost and everything they had survived, and everything they would have to learn to live with. "I kept my promise," he whispered into her hair. "I kept my promise, sweetheart. I came back." Lily held on to her father and did not let go for a very long time. Commander Grace Mitchell was promoted to admiral and given command of the reconstruction fleet, tasked with rebuilding the colonies that had been destroyed and establishing defenses that would ensure nothing like New Haven could ever happen again. She threw herself into the work with the same intensity she had brought to the war, channeling her grief into purpose. honoring the dead by protecting the living. Dr. Samuel Price resigned from government service the day after the treaty was signed and retreated to a small house in the mountains of Colorado. Far from the celebrations and the honors and the people who wanted to call him a hero, he spent his remaining years teaching physics at a small university, never speaking about the weapon he had created, never accepting the medals or recognition that the government tried to give him. When his students asked about the war, he would simply shake his head and change the subject. And eventually, they learned not to ask. The Valorians survived. Barely. The United Earth government provided enough aid to prevent complete extinction, relocating populations to habitable worlds and providing technology to help them rebuild. Not out of kindness, but out of a practical understanding that total genocide would make humanity better than the enemy it had defeated. Many people argued that the Valorians deserved no mercy, that they should be left to freeze in the darkness they had brought upon themselves. But wiser voices prevailed. Humanity had proven it could be as ruthless as any species in the galaxy. Now it needed to prove it could also be merciful. 100 years after the war ended, a monument was built on the ruins of New Haven. A tower of glass and stone that stood 300 meters tall, visible from orbit. Carved from the vitrified earth that had once been a thriving city, the inscription read, "Here stood New Haven. Here 2 million souls were taken from us. Here humanity learned that the stars could be cool. And here we proved that we could be cooler still. May our children never need to make the choices we made. May they build a universe where such monuments are unnecessary. But may they never forget what we were capable of when we had no other choice and among the stars." In the cold reaches of space where empires rose and fell like waves upon an infinite shore, the other species watched. They had observed the war with detached interest, expecting the humans to be destroyed like so many other young races before them, confident that the natural order would be maintained and the Valorian dominion would continue its ancient reign. They had been wrong now. When they looked at the small blue world called Earth, they no longer saw a primitive species struggling to survive. They saw a civilization that had stared into the abyss of extinction and refused to blink. They saw a people who loved deeply and mourned fiercely and fought without mercy when everything they cherished was threatened. They saw humanity, and they were afraid. The Valorians had tried to burn humanity from existence, tried to erase an entire species from the galaxy as if it were nothing more than an error to be corrected. Instead, they had awakened something that would reshape the balance of power for 1,000 generations. Humanity had survived. Humanity had won, and the galaxy would never forget the price of trying to make them do otherwise.